It was the kind of story that never quite left the town, whispered in kitchens, passed down in prayer circles, and avoided in sermons. In the summer of 1975, Pastor Elijah Moore walked into his small rural church in the hills of Georgia and was never seen again. No sign of forced entry, no evidence of foul play. His Bible left open on the pulpit, the lights still on, the doors unlocked. It was as if he had been plucked from the air itself. And over the years, the silence around his disappearance grew heavier than any answer ever could. Families came and went. The church aged with quiet dignity, its paint peeling and pews collecting dust. No new pastor ever stayed long. Some said the church was haunted, not with ghosts, but with grief. Others believed Elijah had run, that he cracked under the weight of ministry and simply vanished. But the old members, those who had known him, loved him, they never accepted that. They spoke of his unwavering kindness, his gentle laugh, and his sermons that felt like soft thunder, powerful, but never meant to frighten. And then, on an unremarkable morning, nearly 40 years later, everything changed. A restoration crew arrived to renovate the abandoned church. Their task was simple: tear down the basement walls to install new wiring. But what they found behind the bricks halted every hammer in Madare. It wasn't just a clue. It was an answer, one that no one had asked for in decades, and yet somehow, everyone had been waiting for. Dust fell like ash as the workers stood frozen. A narrow, bricked-up room, a rusted chair, a journal, half decayed, sitting beside a pair of broken reading glasses. It was clear now, Elijah hadn't left. He had been hidden, locked away beneath the very ground where he once preached of salvation. The question no longer was what happened to him. It was who had the power to bury the truth and why. But this story isn't just about what was discovered in the dark. It's about what light does when it's finally allowed back in. About the secrets that small towns carry like sacred burdens. And about a man who never stopped speaking, even when no one could hear him. The discovery in the church basement sent a ripple through the town like a tremor beneath the surface of calm water. Local authorities arrived within hours, but their presence felt more ceremonial than investigative, a gesture for closure, not justice. The basement had remained untouched for nearly 4 decades, sealed off behind layers of brick and plaster no one ever thought to question. And now, in the cold glow of the construction lamps, the truth began to breathe again. The journal, though damaged by time and dampness, still held legible entries. Its cover was cracked, but Elijah's name was there, written in his unmistakable cursive. Each page was dated, revealing a slow, meticulous record of days spent in confinement. No anger, no desperation, just observations, scriptures, prayers, and questions. Why am I still here? Will they ever hear me? Have I been forgotten by the living, or only by the loudest among them? The reading glasses beside the journal were rusted, their frames bent out of shape as if handled often, but with fading strength. The chair, though simple, had the grooves of a man who sat long hours, waiting, reflecting, enduring. The room had no window, no light source, just a sealed door, a cracked pipe, and silence. Whoever locked it had done so with precision, ensuring Elijah would be erased not only from the church above, but from time itself. Word spread quickly, but the town's reaction wasn't immediate outrage. It was shame, an unbearable, creeping awareness that they had prayed above his grave, sung hymns over his tomb, asked for blessings from a pulpit built on buried pain. And through all those years, no one questioned the silence loud enough to shake the dust from the truth. The eldest members of the congregation gathered at the church steps that evening, candles in hand, tears on their cheeks. Not one of them could remember the last sermon Elijah gave, but all of them remembered how he made them feel, seen, heard, safe. And now, standing above where he had been left to fade, they wondered how many things they had refused to see simply because silence was easier than sorrow. As investigators reviewed the journal, a pattern began to emerge. Elijah hadn't been alone in his suffering, not spiritually, and perhaps not even physically. Several entries referenced muffled voices, distant footsteps, even notes slipped under the door. It became clear he hadn't been forgotten entirely. Someone knew. Someone chose to leave him there. And worse, someone visited just enough to give him hope, but never freedom. The town's records were incomplete from that era. A fire in 1981 had destroyed boxes of old paperwork. But oral histories carried weight, and whispers began to point toward names long buried, both in cemeteries and in reputation. The former deacon, Harold Greaves. The maintenance man, Joe Wickers. A woman known only as Sister Lila, who vanished from the congregation a year after Elijah's disappearance. They had always been respected figures. Now their stories cracked at the seams. What motive could justify such a fate? Elijah's entries offered clues, vague at first, then sharper. He wrote about uncovering church funds being misused, about standing up against hidden abuses, about the resistance he met when preaching not just salvation, but accountability. They fear truth more than darkness, he wrote once. And in that fear, they built mine. It wasn't just betrayal. It was fear weaponized by power. A quiet man who refused to turn a blind eye, punished not with exile, but with silence. The kind of punishment designed to erase not just the person, but the idea of him, to trap both body and message beneath stone, out of reach from the flock he tried to protect. And yet, he wrote, day after day, year after year. His last entry was dated 3 days before the journal ends. The ink faded, the handwriting shaky, but the words were still there. If the river returns to the sea, surely my voice will return to them. As if Elijah believed, even in his final moments, that the truth could still rise through the floorboards, through the decades, and be heard. The community couldn't escape the weight of it. Every hymn they sang now echoed differently. Every wall of the church felt colder, older. But it wasn't just grief, it was accountability. Parents sat their children down and told them the truth, trembling. Grown men who had served under Elijah all those years ago now wept openly in town hall, admitting how they ignored his warnings, dismissed his worries, and chose comfort over confrontation. An emergency town meeting was called in the fellowship hall, the same space where Elijah once taught evening scripture. The mood was solemn. No one shouted. No one accused. The silence spoke for them all. A single table displayed Elijah's recovered journal and glasses. People passed by it slowly, one by one, many kneeling without being asked. And for the first time in over 40 years, the basement below their feet wasn't a secret. It was a sacred wound, finally shown to the light. But what disturbed the town most wasn't the physical confinement Elijah endured. It was how many people likely knew in pieces. A glance exchanged here, a comment silenced there, signs missed, warnings brushed aside. Truth, it seemed, had always been present, but it had required courage to look straight at it. And that courage had come too late. Children asked the hardest questions. Why didn't anyone go looking for him? Did God forget him too? Questions that tore into the older generation with a sting sharper than any headline or accusation ever could. Because deep down, they all understood Elijah hadn't just been failed by a few corrupt individuals. He had been failed by silence. Still, within that devastation, something began to stir. Not a desire for vengeance, but for redemption. The kind that doesn't erase the past, but builds something better because of it. And in that, the town began to find a new voice, not louder, but braver. In the following weeks, the basement was transformed, not renovated, not repainted, but preserved, exactly as it had been found. A transparent wall was installed so visitors could see the space without disturbing it. Above it, a plaque with Elijah's final words, "Surely my voice will return to them." It became a place of pilgrimage, not for spectacle, but for silence, a space where the weight of consequence met the possibility of grace. Among the visitors was a man named Thomas Greaves, the grandson of the former deacon. He had grown up hearing only praise for his grandfather, stories of devotion and leadership. Now he stood before the truth, trembling. And he did something no one expected. He knelt and read aloud from Elijah's journal, word for word, in front of the congregation. His voice shook, cracked, but he didn't stop. It was the first time many had heard Elijah's thoughts spoken aloud. As he read, some wept silently. Others held hands. A few left the room, unable to breathe through the guilt. But no one questioned the importance of the moment. It was, in many ways, Elijah's first sermon in over 4 decades. A sermon from the grave, filled not with condemnation, but with clarity. Forgiveness was never easy, but truth made it possible. Journalists from surrounding cities caught wind of the story. A few attempted to sensationalize it, but the town resisted. They asked that the story be told not with headlines, but with humanity. Not as a scandal, but as a caution and a calling. Because Elijah wasn't just a victim. He was a voice, one that chose integrity over safety, truth over popularity, and faith, even in the absence of freedom. And as his words echoed through those pews once more, it became clear Elijah had never stopped being their pastor. He had simply continued his ministry in silence, waiting patiently for the day his message would rise through stone, through shame, and finally be heard. Some nights, people returned to the church not for service, but simply to sit, to feel. The pews, once empty for years, now held quiet bodies and open hearts. No one preached. No one sang. And yet, the stillness spoke louder than any voice could. They weren't attending a sermon. They were attending their own reckoning, and in doing so, honoring Elijah's. One evening, a woman named Margaret Holt stood and spoke. She had been a teenager in 1975, and she remembered the night he vanished. How her mother locked the doors tighter than usual. How her father burned a piece of paper in the fireplace without explanation. She had lived with the weight of that memory for decades, unsure if it mattered. Now, she knew it did. And for the first time, she said aloud, "I think my parents knew something. And I think I was taught to forget." The town wasn't built on malice. It was built on omission, on the subtle, daily choices to not ask, not dig, not remember. That's what made Elijah's story so painful. Not that it was unheard of, but that it could have been prevented. He had warned them in whispers, in glances, in soft-spoken sermons. But they had been too afraid to confront the darkness inside their own church walls. Now, they weren't running from it. They were facing it. And more than that, they were documenting it. A group of students from the local college began recording oral histories. They interviewed elders, collected testimonies, digitized every journal page. They didn't want justice alone. They wanted memory. Preserved. Protected. So that no one could ever claim again that Pastor Elijah Moore had simply disappeared. In that quiet urgency, something beautiful emerged. A multi-generational promise. That silence would no longer be their legacy. That this church, once used to imprison a man of God, would now become a sanctuary of truth. And in that promise, Elijah's life began to glow once more. Not as a victim's tale, but as a torch for all who walk afraid to speak. Stories began surfacing, not just about Elijah, but about others who had once been dismissed. A teacher who raised concerns about a board member. A mother whose son had spoken of strange behavior during altar service. Each story came like a ripple from the original wound, proof that Elijah's suffering had not been isolated. His silence had not been the only one buried. What made Elijah's story endure wasn't only the injustice he faced. It was his refusal to respond with hate. His journal was never filled with rage or revenge. Only reflection. Scriptures woven into daily thoughts. Lines like God strengthens not the loudest, but the longest. And, if the light never finds me, may I still be lit for those who follow. These words began appearing on posters, murals, even school assemblies. He became more than a lost pastor. He became a symbol of resilience. The story reached national ears. A documentary crew arrived, led by a filmmaker who had once been a theology student himself. He wept while reading Elijah's journal. "This is sacred literature," he whispered, "a gospel of endurance." The documentary was filmed quietly, respectfully. No dramatic music, no actors, just voices. Honest, trembling, human voices, telling the truth at last. The basement was renamed Elijah's Chamber, and though many wished to cleanse it, repaint it, make it new, the town chose to let it remain untouched. Because sometimes, healing doesn't mean erasing the past. It means carrying it with clarity, letting it shape the future. Visitors from other states began arriving. Some came with their own stories. Others came just to listen, to sit in the stillness where one man refused to let darkness silence faith. And through all of it, the most powerful transformation wasn't in the building, or even the town. It was in the people. in their willingness to look inward, to ask the harder questions, to walk the uncomfortable path. Elijah had done so alone, beneath the ground. Now, they were doing it together, above, in the light. As the seasons shifted and the initial wave of shock began to settle, the town realized something subtle yet undeniable. They were changing. The younger generation, those who had only heard whispers of the past, now asked questions not with suspicion, but with purpose. Teachers adjusted their lesson plans. Sunday school instructors spoke openly about moral courage, and sermons, once guarded, now rang with truth, even when it trembled. Elijah's former home, a modest white cottage near the edge of town, had long stood abandoned. The windows boarded. The fence collapsed. But now it too became a focus. A group of volunteers, teenagers and elders side by side, began restoring it. Not as a monument, but as a library, a place to house testimonies, records, writings on justice and forgiveness. They named it Elijah's Porch because it was there, according to an old neighbor, that Elijah used to sit in the evenings, welcoming anyone with a question or pain. Inside the house, they discovered one final artifact, a small wooden cross tucked inside the fireplace mantel, carved by hand. Simple. On the back, in faded pen, "Remain kind, even when hidden." It was Elijah's handwriting. Another piece of him, surfacing decades later, just as powerful as the rest. And in that tiny token, people saw the core of who he was. Not just a preacher, but a steady light, even when buried in shadow. What struck the town most wasn't the horror of his death. It was the beauty of his endurance. He had been denied the freedom to speak, but never the will to believe. Even without an audience, he kept writing. Even without windows, he envisioned the sun. That kind of faith, untouched by fear or fury, now pulsed through the community like a quiet revival. Not loud, not performative, just real. And in those quiet acts, a child planting flowers at Elijah's chamber, a pastor quoting him from the pulpit, a mother explaining his story as a bedtime tale, the healing deepened. It wasn't about moving on. It was about moving differently, with eyes open, with hearts softened, with the courage to ask, who are we in silence? And what do we choose when no one is watching? Not everyone found comfort in the revelations. For some, the past still burned too sharply. There were families whose legacies were now stained, descendants of those who had once sat on church committees or held keys to the basement. Some left town quietly. Others stayed but spoke little. And for them, forgiveness wasn't a word on a plaque. It was a long, aching road. Yet even among them, seeds of grace began to take root. A woman named Carol Denning, granddaughter of Sister Lila, stood during a town gathering and read a letter. It was her grandmother's final confession, written but never mailed, addressed to Elijah himself. In it, Lila admitted knowing he had been locked away, but claimed fear kept her silent. "I thought my prayers were enough," the letter read. But prayer without action is cowardice in disguise. The letter shattered the room. Some gasped, others sobbed, but no one jeered. Because it wasn't just an admission. It was a mirror. Everyone could see some part of themselves in those words, the tendency to wait, to avoid, to assume someone else will speak first. That was Elijah's true legacy. Not just martyrdom, but awakening. The documentary was released online under the title The Pastor Below. It reached millions. But what touched the town most was not the attention. It was the letters. Hundreds of them. From strangers. From pastors. From survivors of injustice. From children. Each one spoke of how Elijah's story had cracked something open in them. Made them braver. Made them softer. Made them believe again. Not in institutions, but in integrity. The town, once small and nameless, now bore a different reputation. Not one of scandal, but of transformation. A place where truth, though buried, had been unearthed. Where a man, long silenced, had finally preached the sermon of his life. Not with a microphone, not with a stage, but with ink and endurance. And that sermon still echoed, more alive than ever. And as winter crept in and the church bells rang in colder air, the community gathered not to forget the pain, but to remember the courage. They stood, hand in hand, above the place where Elijah had once waited in the dark, and now, together, they stood in the light. In the months that followed the documentary's release, something unexpected began to happen. Other small towns, some hundreds of miles away, started reaching out. Pastors called to say they had watched the film with their congregations. Teachers added it to their curriculum. Survivors of injustice, silenced for years, now had a name to speak: Elijah. His story gave their stories permission to surface. Letters arrived in bulk. A woman from Nebraska wrote, "I thought I was crazy for remembering the things they told me to forget." A retired chaplain from Ohio said, "He reminded me why I ever became a man of God in the first place." And a 12-year-old boy from Michigan sent a drawing of a church with a light pouring from the basement, writing simply, "So no one has to hide anymore." But perhaps the most stirring response came from prison. Inmates who watched the documentary during their weekly faith study were struck silent. One of them, a man convicted decades ago, wrote to the town directly, "I've never cried over a stranger before." But Elijah wasn't a stranger. He was what I could have been if someone had listened. The letter was framed and hung near the entrance of Elijah's chamber. That quiet basement room, once the scene of betrayal, had become a lighthouse for countless souls. People came and wept not just for Elijah, but for themselves, for the silences they kept, the truths they avoided, the lives they never defended. They didn't leave healed, but they left changed, because they had stood in the presence of truth, raw, unpolished, and holy. And in that sacred space, something unspoken connected everyone who entered. They didn't know Elijah personally. They had never heard his sermons, never shaken his hand, but somehow they knew him. Through his suffering, through his words, through his refusal to let the dark define him. He was no longer just a pastor from a forgotten town. He was a symbol, not of pain, but of purpose. Meanwhile, Elijah's journal, now fully digitized and archived, was being read in seminaries and theology schools across the country. Scholars couldn't quite agree on how to categorize it. It wasn't a diary, not in the traditional sense, nor was it a theological treatise. It was something in between, deeply personal, but universal in its longing for justice, kindness, and divine presence, even in captivity. One particular passage became iconic. He wrote, "If I am meant to be hidden, then let me be hidden like a seed, not forgotten, but buried for a greater bloom." Those words were etched into stone and placed at the foot of the church steps, where every visitor would see them before entering. A reminder that what looks like the end is often only the beginning of something deeper. The youth of the town took it to heart. They started the Hidden Seed Initiative, a program that trained young leaders to spot injustice in their communities, to speak up with grace and truth, and to preserve the stories of those who came before them. No one wanted another Elijah to be buried without voice. This time, they would be ready. This time, they would listen. On what would have been Elijah's 80th birthday, the town held a quiet vigil. There were no fireworks, no dramatic speeches, just candles, hundreds of them, lining the path from the church to his cottage. Children carried them, their faces glowing, their hands steady. And for a full hour, not a single word was spoken, only the sound of breath, wind, and memory. It was not a funeral. It was a declaration. That night, one could almost imagine Elijah standing among them, not as a ghost, but as a presence, calm, smiling, proud. Not because justice had been served perfectly, but because truth had finally risen. And truth, once it takes root, has a way of reaching farther than anyone ever expects. It was in a dusty attic in northern Louisiana where another unexpected piece of Elijah's legacy surfaced. A woman named Corinne Masters, cleaning out her late uncle's farmhouse, stumbled across a box marked only with the words "to be returned someday." Inside were cassette tapes, old, brittle, most too damaged to play. But one, dated October of 1974, remained intact. And on it, Elijah's voice. The recording was raw. No audience. Just Elijah, perhaps rehearsing a sermon. "The world may not recognize the value of quiet obedience," he said softly, "but heaven sees what the earth tries to erase." Corinne didn't know who he was, but her neighbor did. The tapes were sent back to Elijah's hometown. When played during a Sunday morning service, no one moved. No one breathed. For the first time in 40 years, the town heard his voice. It was not angry, not broken. It was clear, steady, and full of that same kind grace that had filled his writings. He spoke of forgiveness not as weakness, but as defiance, of love as an act of resistance, of faith that outlives the grave. And when the tape clicked off, no one clapped. They simply stood in silence, many with tears falling freely, as if receiving his final benediction. That audio became sacred, not just a relic, but a living thread. It was remastered and broadcast on community radio across the region. And soon, it reached further, downloaded in youth programs, played at vigils, shared across continents. The voice of a man who had once been silenced was now echoing around the globe. Not through force, not through fame, but through truth, whispered with conviction. And that's what Elijah had always believed in. Not power, not performance, just presence. The courage to be present, even when unseen. To speak, even if no one listens. Because truth, like a seed, doesn't need a crowd. It only needs soil. As Elijah's message traveled, so did the questions it raised. Journalists asked how a man could disappear for decades without justice. Lawmakers questioned oversight in rural systems. Faith leaders reckoned with their silence. But the town didn't resist scrutiny. They welcomed it. Because they knew the only thing worse than being wrong is refusing to grow from it. One night, during a university panel about the case, a student asked a question that silenced the room. If Elijah hadn't suffered, would we have changed? No one had a quick answer. Because the truth hurt. His pain had become their teacher. And that was the tragedy and the miracle. That one man's endurance had awakened thousands to the urgency of courage. In a nearby city, a group of artists painted a mural 5 stories tall. It showed a man in a tattered robe, sitting alone, holding a lantern that burned despite the wind. At his feet were roots stretching downward, and above him, a canopy of light. The mural was titled Buried, Not Gone, and under it, a plaque read, Inspired by Elijah Moore, whose silence changed the world. But perhaps the most intimate tribute came from those who changed quietly. A father who apologized to his son for never listening. A pastor who rewrote his sermon with less certainty and more empathy. A teacher who told a scared child, "Your truth matters, even if it's inconvenient." These were not dramatic gestures, but they were seismic shifts, proof that Elijah's light had not just been found, but passed on. And through it all, his journal continued to be read. Not like scripture, not like history, but like a conversation still in motion. With every page, readers heard a man who refused to let cruelty define him, who believed that light, even in the smallest flicker, could survive any darkness. And because of that belief, it did. As the world leaned into Elijah's story, the town found itself both humbled and watched. Reporters came not for scandal, but to understand the fabric of change, how a forgotten basement became sacred ground. One journalist wrote, "It wasn't the church that changed the people. It was the people who made the church sacred again." That observation struck a chord because it revealed what many locals had come to believe. Redemption isn't just about uncovering the truth. It's about how you live with it. Elijah's chamber was no longer cold and lifeless. Local artists had painted soft murals along its walls, imagery of wild olive trees, light emerging from roots, birds flying from cages. There are no plaques of vengeance, no names of those responsible, just symbols of endurance. It wasn't a shrine to suffering. It was a canvas for rebirth. Visitors often came with stories of their own, survivors of silence, people who had been dismissed, ignored, buried emotionally. One woman knelt by the door and whispered, "He waited so long in silence, maybe I can finally stop being afraid to speak." A man who hadn't prayed in 20 years touched the brick and said, "If he still believed, maybe I can try again." Elijah had not just endured, he had given others a map back to themselves. And with every story shared inside that room, the space transformed. It wasn't just the site of his suffering anymore. It was now a sanctuary for every person who had ever been unseen. A space where pain wasn't denied, but acknowledged. Where silence wasn't emptiness, but a language of its own. Where healing didn't require forgetting, only remembering differently. That kind of space doesn't happen overnight. It's carved by grief, washed by time, sealed by hope. And in the heartbeat of that basement, generations now felt a quiet kind of courage, the kind that says, even buried truths grow back stronger. Even the coldest walls can echo with life. Back at Elijah's cottage, the volunteers discovered a small wooden box beneath the floorboards, wrapped in cloth, sealed with wax. Inside it, a stack of unsent letters, each addressed to a different member of the congregation. They weren't angry. They weren't accusatory. They were filled with hope. One by one, he had written to those he loved, as if believing somehow, someday, his words would reach them. To Sister Bernice, he wrote, "Don't stop playing piano. Music is how God breathes through pain." To young Daniel, just 12 at the time, "You will lead someday. Led with gentleness, the world has enough noise." And to Thomas, the deacon who had vanished after Elijah's disappearance, "Even if your hands failed you, your soul can still choose truth." Each letter became a seed, blooming forgiveness in the hearts of the living. Word of the letters spread quickly. Some families wept. Some rejoiced. Some felt freed from decades of guilt they hadn't known they carried. And in that strange alchemy, sorrow meeting grace, the community found a language deeper than justice, restoration. Elijah hadn't waited with resentment. He had waited with love. The final letter, however, had no name. It simply read, "To the one reading this." In it, Elijah wrote, "If my story finds you, know that you were meant to carry light, not just admire it. Do not bear your voice out of fear. If I had only one thing left to give, it would be this: you matter. Even if the world forgets your name, heaven never does." That letter now rests in a glass case at the center of Elijah's porch, not because it's rare, but because it belongs to everyone. People come and stand before it as if visiting a sacred mirror. They don't always cry. They don't always speak. But most leave changed, because those words, written in confinement, never meant to be seen, somehow carried the power to free. And in that freedom, Elijah became more than a figure from history. He became a friend to the broken, a voice to the silent, a promise to the buried that light, no matter how long denied, always finds a way back to the surface. Years passed, but the momentum didn't fade. Instead, it rippled across counties, across countries. People who had never stepped foot in that old church began referencing Elijah in speeches, classrooms, recovery meetings. His name, once a painful whisper, had become a beacon, shorthand for courage forged in silence, for truth that outlives betrayal. The town decided not to rename any buildings or streets after him. Instead, they dedicated a quiet trail through the woods he once walked. No signs, no plaques, just a path. One that begins where the church ends, as if to say, the story isn't over, it just continues differently now. Locals began calling it the Listening Way. Along its route, benches were placed under trees, with verses from his journal etched into stone. One said, "Some darkness isn't meant to be destroyed, only understood." Another read, "I was not buried. I was planted. There's a difference." These small lines, born in solitude, now guided strangers through moments of reflection. Teenagers walked the trail to process heartbreak. Veterans came to remember what they'd survived. Widows sat alone and whispered prayers no one else could hear, except maybe Elijah. Some claimed they could feel him there, not in a supernatural sense, but in a deeper, quieter knowing, as if the ground itself remembered his steps, as if the air, once heavy with silence, now carried his peace. The Listening Way became more than a trail. It became a place where people came not to speak, but to finally be heard, even if only by the trees. And somewhere between the beginning of that path and the end, something shifted in the hearts of those who walked it. They came looking for answers. They left carrying something better. A question: what story am I burying? And who might need it to bloom? In one particularly cold winter, a snowstorm cut off the town for nearly a week. Electricity failed. Roads closed. But the church, now refurbished and warm with lantern light, remained open. Volunteers lit candles, played quiet hymns on acoustic strings, and read aloud entries from Elijah's journal each evening, as if to keep hope burning, word by word. Children curled up in blankets and listened. Elders nodded gently, eyes closed, as if remembering not just Elijah, but their own youth. Strangers who had sought shelter sat side by side in pews, hands cupped around warm tea, united not by doctrine, but by the hush that only truth can bring. And every night, as the final candle burned low, someone would whisper the words Elijah had once written, "Let light rise where voices fell." After the thaw, a young girl named Ruth, no more than 10, asked her mother if Elijah was a saint. Her mother hesitated. "He wasn't perfect," she said, "but maybe that's the point." Ruth thought for a moment, then nodded. "Then I want to be like him. Someone who listens." That simple statement, spoken without ceremony, captured everything the town had become. Elijah wasn't worshipped. He wasn't idolized. He was remembered, in the truest sense of the word. His life had been pieced back together not through glory, but through grace. And in doing so, he gave people permission to remember themselves differently, too. Not by the moment they were broken, but by the courage they showed after. As spring returned, the church bells rang again, not to announce a sermon, but to celebrate quiet things. A birth, a reunion, a poem written by a child and read aloud by a teacher. Little echoes of life, once buried, now blooming boldly, without fear. The town didn't need to be famous. It only needed to stay faithful, to truth, to kindness, and to the man who reminded them that both still matter. One afternoon, a letter arrived at the town's small historical society. It came from Nairobi, Kenya, written in careful English by a theology student named Damaris. She had come across Elijah's story through an old podcast episode, and something in his words struck her like thunder. She wrote, "I did not know his voice, but I felt known by it." Her letter was filled with reflections, gratitude, and one simple request: "May I come and walk the trail where he once walked?" Weeks later, Damaris arrived, carrying only a worn Bible, a leather-bound journal, and a reverence that was almost sacred. She spent her days in silence along the listening way, scribbling quietly, often stopping to press her hand against tree trunks or close her eyes as the wind moved through the branches. She didn't come for spectacle. She came to listen, to a man she never met, in a town that welcomed her as one of their own. At a small gathering before she returned home, she stood and read a single passage from her journal. Some truths are not taught. They're transferred, spirit to spirit, silence to silence. She looked out the crowd and added, "Elijah didn't just survive his silence. He baptized it. He made it holy." That night, no one clapped. They simply stood and placed their hands over their hearts, united in something too deep for applause. Inspired by her words, the town began a new tradition, the Night of Stillness. Once a year, on the date Elijah vanished, the entire community would gather in the church. No sound, no lights, no preaching, just presence. Families sat side by side in silence. Teens leaned against each other under quilts. Even the restless children settled into the hush. It wasn't a vigil for the past. It was a vigil for the sacred now. And in that stillness, people discovered something profound. Silence, when chosen, can be as loud as any sermon. It was in that shared breath, that unspoken understanding, that Elijah's presence felt most alive, not haunting, not distant, but gently holding everyone there. As the years unfurled, those who once feared Elijah's story now embraced it as part of their own. One retired sheriff, who had served during the early days of Elijah's disappearance, requested to be buried beside the church. In his will, he wrote, "Let me rest where truth rose. It's where I found peace at last." He had once been silent. Now, in death, he chose to stand beside the man he once failed to protect. Children born long after Elijah's time knew his name like folklore. But what made it different from myth was its humanity. Elijah wasn't remembered as a hero. He was remembered as someone real. Someone who bled, who wept, who waited, and who never let the world make him bitter. His was a story not of power, but of persistent grace. And that made him unforgettable. One young boy, Leo, wrote an essay for school titled "The Man Under the Church." In it, he described Elijah as a gardener. He planted truth underground, and now were the flowers. His teacher wept reading it, not from sadness, but because it captured something every adult had struggled to name, that what Elijah suffered had become the soil of something rare, a community rooted in empathy. Over time, pilgrimages to the church grew. Not large, not commercial, but intentional. People brought burdens. Some brought ashes. Some brought broken relationships. Some brought questions they had never dared speak aloud. And while they didn't always leave with answers, they often left lighter. Not because their pain was erased, but because it had finally been witnessed. Elijah's grave was never found. His body, if buried, remains hidden. But no one seemed to need it anymore, because what he left behind was not tied to bones or stone. It lived in breath, in ink, in pauses, in the way strangers now looked at one another, as if silently asking, "Are you still carrying something too?" And just maybe, finding the courage to say, "Me too." One morning, an elderly woman named Clara, who had been just a child when Elijah disappeared, returned to the church with a bundle wrapped in velvet. Inside it, a tape recorder, dusty, fragile, but intact. She explained that her father had once been part of the church board, and this recorder had been tucked away in the attic for decades. "I think you should hear this," she said. The community gathered that evening in reverent silence as the old tape was played. Elijah's voice, soft, deliberate, unmistakable, filled the room. He was reciting a prayer, not a sermon, not a speech, just a simple plea. Let them be brave enough to see. Let them be soft enough to feel. And when they fall silent, let them fall into you. The words carried through the air like wind through tall grass, gentle, but unforgettable. Some cried. Others sat still, stunned by the intimacy of hearing a man long gone speak so clearly into the present. His voice was not ghostly, not distant. It was alive. And for many, that single moment healed what decades of noise had only buried deeper. Because in his voice, they didn't just hear prayer. They heard themselves, their wounds, their hope, their longing to believe that pain, too, could be transformed. The recording became part of a ritual. Every Sunday evening, as the sun slipped behind the hills, it would be played in the sanctuary. Not to worship Elijah, but to remember what his voice gave them permission to do. Feel again. The walls, once witnesses of his silence, now amplified his courage, line by line, breath by breath. And slowly, Elijah's story turned into something greater than the tale of a missing pastor. It became a compass, a measure of what it means to hold on, to wait in love, and to choose light, not after the storm ends, but while it still rages around you. The final transformation came not through words, but through choices. The town, once quiet and wounded, became a place of sanctuary. Young people stayed. Artists returned. Silence was no longer feared. It was honored. Instead of hiding their histories, families began telling them, not just the beautiful parts, but the ones that shaped their strength in secret. A school was built near the edge of the listening way, where students learned not only math and science, but empathy and storytelling. Every student, before graduating, was invited to walk the trail in solitude, a rite of passage, not to find answers, but to remember they were part of a much older, much deeper story, one that began with a man who refused to let cruelty steal his kindness. Inside the school, on the wall by the entrance, a single phrase carved in wood, "Even buried light remembers how to rise." Visitors often paused to run their fingers across the grain. Some whispered thank you. Some just stood, eyes closed. And some, like Elijah had done, simply listened. And so, the man whose name once vanished from records, who disappeared beneath the very church he loved, became the heartbeat of a village that finally learned how to feel again. Not perfectly, not without pain, but with the kind of bravery that outlasts silence. Elijah's legacy was never about being found. It was about what happens when someone refuses to disappear, even when buried. When someone dares to believe that truth, like seeds, sleeps until it's time to bloom. And when it finally does, no wall, no lie, no time can keep it from reaching the light. In a quiet apartment on the other side of the world, a woman named Anna read Elijah's story on a translated website. She had never been to America. She had no connection to rural churches or missing pastors. But something about his silence mirrored her own. She had lived for years without speaking of her past, of the losses, of the betrayals, of the heaviness she carried. Yet with every word she read, she felt less alone. She printed a photo of the church, framed it, and placed it on her nightstand. Not because she worshipped the place, but because it reminded her that healing didn't need fanfare. That sometimes the quietest lives leave the loudest echoes. Every night before bed, Anna would write just one sentence in a notebook. Sentences like, "I exist even if no one applauds," or "There's power in being overlooked." She called her Elijah Pages. Meanwhile, back in the town, a teenage boy who had struggled with stuttering found strength in Elijah's story. He told his teacher, "If Elijah could be buried and still be heard, maybe my words don't have to be fast-a-matter." He started recording poems, softly spoken, sometimes cracked, and uploading them anonymously. The first one simply said, "My silence isn't empty. It's waiting." Listeners from across the globe began leaving comments. Thousands. What Elijah taught wasn't that pain disappears, but that it becomes bearable when someone else dares to name it. He didn't leave behind doctrine or declarations. He left behind honesty. And that honesty became a bridge across languages, across faiths, across decades of shame. For people like Anna, and that boy, and countless others, Elijah became a mirror that didn't distort them, but finally made them feel seen. And so, without intending to, Elijah created a movement, not of followers, but of feelers, of listeners, of those who knew how to sit with sorrow and still choose grace. His absence had become the presence that so many broken souls never knew they needed, until they heard his story and whispered, "That's me too." Some years later, a documentary filmmaker arrived in town. She didn't come with a big crew or flashing lights, just a camera, a notebook, and reverence. "I don't want to tell his story," she said during her first community meeting. "I want to understand how he changed yours." Her approach surprised everyone. She didn't interview experts. She interviewed gardeners, barbers, schoolchildren, widows, people who had breathed the same air Elijah once did. The film, titled The Weight of Silence, premiered at a small festival and was never meant to be famous. But something about its stillness captivated the world. It wasn't flashy. It wasn't shocking. It was deeply human. It showed people sitting beside trees, lighting candles, reading from old pages, holding hands in silence. And in the background, Elijah's voice from the recovered tape, playing like a heartbeat beneath every image. Critics called it the most important quiet film of the decade. But the townspeople just called it true. It traveled through community centers, hospitals, refugee shelters. It was used in grief groups, therapy rooms, and prison programs. One inmate wrote to the filmmaker, "Elijah reminded me that even buried people deserve light. That I still do." And with that, Elijah's presence crossed yet another boundary, from memory to message, from rural preacher to global symbol of redemptive silence. His story wasn't rewritten. It was simply re-listened. And each time it was shared, it didn't get louder. It got deeper. It burrowed further into the hearts of those who thought they had nothing left to give, nothing left to hope. And maybe that's what Elijah always knew. That silence is not the absence of meaning, but the invitation to find it. That being forgotten is not the end. It's the beginning of being remembered in the right way. And that some truths do not need a shout to change the world. They only need to stay. As the story matured in the collective memory of the town, something even more profound began to take shape. A theology not of words, but of wounds. People no maze sought perfection in their faith or answers in certainty. They started honoring the process of not knowing, the holiness of waiting, and the beauty in admitting, "I don't understand, but I'm still here." The church, once closed off and nearly forgotten, became a place not for preaching, but for presence. The pulpit was replaced with a circle of chairs. The sermons were replaced with silence, music, or sometimes just shared breathing. What began as a reaction to tragedy was now a deliberate choice, to rebuild a community where listening was sacred and where pain didn't have to be fixed to be welcomed. People came not for spectacle, but for shelter. A man who had lost his wife and hadn't spoken in public for 3 years came and sat every Sunday, eyes closed, hands trembling. A woman who had survived abuse brought her young daughter and, for the first time, didn't feel like she had to explain herself. No one asked for details. No one pressed for stories. There was an unspoken understanding that healing had its own pace. And Elijah had proven, beyond any doubt, that even if it took 40 years, The truth would surface when it was ready. And when it did, it would be enough. One particular night, during the annual Night of Stillness, an unexpected storm knocked out all electricity in the town. The church went black, but no one moved. No one complained. People simply remained, breathing in the dark together. Children curled into their parents. A candle was eventually lit, and then another. And in that flickering glow, someone began to hum softly, a melody no one could name, but everyone seemed to recognize. It spread from one voice to another, until the room vibrated not with noise, but with something much more powerful, a shared remembering, a knowing. That Elijah wasn't gone. He had become the silence between the notes. That night, someone wrote on a scrap of paper and pinned it to the old altar. "We don't sing to forget him. We sing because he waited long enough to be heard." It stayed there for years, untouched, until the ink began to fade. And even then, no one replaced it, because the message had already been carved into their lives. Elijah had disappeared, yes, but in that disappearance, he had revealed something most people spend a lifetime trying to find: the quiet courage to be who you are, even when the world stops looking for you. And perhaps that's why his story would never fade. Not because it was grand or glamorous or full of dramatic revelations, but because it was deeply, relentlessly human. A reminder that every life, even the quiet ones, especially the quiet ones, carries within it the capacity to outlast brick and time and secrecy. Elijah had not just survived the silence. He had transformed it. And in doing so, he gave others permission to believe that maybe their silence, too, could become sacred. In the decades that followed, Elijah's influence continued to grow, not as folklore, but as foundation. A small publishing house printed a collection of letters, poems, and journal entries inspired by those who had been touched by his story. It was titled Buried Light. The book never made bestseller lists, but it found its way into hospital waiting rooms, military bases, hospice centers, and the hands of people standing at the edge of their own endurance. The pages didn't offer advice or solutions, only reflections. And in them, countless readers found what they didn't even know they were searching for: companionship in their most silent struggles. One letter, written by a retired hospice nurse, captured the essence of what Elijah had come to represent. "In my years of watching people leave this world, I learned that the most important things are rarely said out loud. We hold hands. We breathe together. And sometimes, that's the truest prayer." Her letter was placed at the beginning of the book, not as a preface, but as a benediction. A reminder that Elijah's gift wasn't in what he preached, but in how he bore witness to life, even as it unraveled. Every so often, someone new would stumble upon his story. In a secondhand bookstore, in a digital archive, in the whispered memory of someone they loved. And when they did, they didn't just learn about a pastor who vanished. They learned about the slow miracle of remembrance, about how grief can become gentleness, how silence can become sanctuary, and how truth, when buried, doesn't rot, it roots, it waits, and then, one day it rises. The church itself remained modest. No grand renovations, no polished signs, just weathered wood, soft pews, and a door that never locked. People kept coming, not because of the mystery of Elijah's vanishing, but because of the clarity his presence left behind. It was the kind of place that taught you nothing flashy, but everything essential. How to wait, how to listen, how to believe again, even if only in whispers. And as the town aged, as new generations grew up with Elijah as both myth and memory, one truth endured above all: that love, when quietly lived and bravely held, never disappears. It only changes form. It becomes a path, a note, a pause, a light behind a wall that someone, one day, will finally see. Years passed, and while the world outside changed, faster, louder, more crowded with distractions, the rhythm inside that small village remained unshaken. The story of Elijah became less of a tale to be told, and more of a lens through which life was understood. Children were raised with his name spoken in hushed reverence, not out of fear or superstition, but out of gratitude, as if merely knowing he once walked their paths made their own steps steadier. Teachers used his life not to preach morality, but to teach depth, how to sit in discomfort, how to hold space for unanswered questions, how to recognize the quiet bravery in others. Elijah had become a thread woven through the fabric of ordinary lives, pulling people gently toward grace. Some say the true test of a legacy is how it changes the future, and Elijah's impact did just that. A new generation grew up not only with his name, but with his spirit guiding their choices. A young girl, barely 16, once stood up at a town meeting and said, "We should build more benches, not more fences." When asked why, she simply answered, "Because Elijah waited. And if we had benches then, maybe someone would have waited with him." Her words struck something deep. The town, without debate, added dozens of benches across its quietest spaces. By the river, along the listening way, outside the church, places where people could sit and not say a word. Just listen, just remember. One bench, carved in cedar and placed beneath the oldest tree on the church grounds, bore a brass plaque with a sentence no one remembered writing, but everyone recognized. Truth never dies. It just waits until we're ready. Visitors from far away would sit there for hours. Some cried, some laughed, some said nothing at all. And in those moments of stillness, Elijah's story continued, not through repetition, but through resonance. It was as if he had never really left, only shifted into something invisible and eternal, like breath between branches, like warmth in winter, like love you never got to say, but still feel every day. The town's library began to collect letters, poems, sketches, and journals from anyone touched by the story. They were cataloged not by date or author, but by emotion. There was a room of silence, filled with pieces that express loss. A room of wonder, where children's drawings danced with imagined scenes of Elijah's journey. And the most visited, the room of return, where people who once walked away from faith, from family, from themselves, left behind their confessions, their renewals, their thank yous. Not one entry was edited. Not one page was judged. It was a sanctuary of story, born not from doctrine, but from a human need to feel seen and held. And so, Elijah, the man who vanished without a word, became the voice that thousands listened to, not because he demanded to be heard, but because he waited, with dignity, to be understood. Somewhere in a quiet city apartment, a professor of theology, hardened by decades of skepticism, read a feature about Elijah in an obscure publication. She had grown tired of religion, tired of systems, dogmas, and the way sacred texts had been weaponized. But Elijah's story unsettled her. It was, in her words, the first sacred thing I've read in 20 years that didn't try to convince me. It just let me feel. She printed the article, folded it carefully, and slid it between the pages of her thickest book. Not to study it, but to protect it, like something alive, fragile, worth sheltering. She began her next semester with a new syllabus. No theological arguments, no philosophical debates. Instead, she asked her students one question: what story would you leave behind if you had no words left? The classroom changed. Students who had never spoken before shared stories of grief, hope, faith lost and found. Elijah's story, once contained to a basement in a forgotten church, was now shaping minds that would shape the world, and not by providing them answers, but by awakening their questions. In another part of the world, a war reporter watched the same documentary that had once moved prisoners and poets alike. He had seen unspeakable horrors. He had lost friends, and with them, his belief in anything good. But something about Elijah's story, about the quiet persistence of light, cracked open a door he thought was forever sealed. He returned his camera not to chase pain, but to search for beauty. His next film captured children painting hope on crumbled walls, elderly women planting trees in soil scorched by bombs. He named it The Waiting Ones. In the credits, he wrote, "For the man who listened until he disappeared, and kept listening long after." And back in the village, the river that had once revealed Elijah's final message still flowed, unchanged. Children now played on its banks. Couples carved their initials into the trees nearby. And on certain evenings, when the wind was just right, some swore they could still hear the faint hum of a melody echoing through the branches. It wasn't eerie. It wasn't sad. It was comforting, like a hand on your shoulder. like someone telling you, you're not alone. Elijah's name, etched into no grand monument, still lived, in whispers, in rituals, in resilience. His story had become more than a narrative. It had become an inheritance, a shared truth passed from soul to soul, generation to generation. And all because one man disappeared, not in despair, but in faith. Faith that when the world was finally ready, it would hear him. As the 40th anniversary of Elijah's disappearance approached, there was no official ceremony planned. No speeches, no marble statue to unveil. Yet people began arriving days in advance, uninvited and unannounced, as if drawn by a pull that defied language. They came from nearby towns, distant countries, quiet corners of forgotten lives. They didn't wear matching colors or chant in unison. They brought candles, yes, but also journals, scraps of old letters, broken keepsakes from people they'd lost, as if this pilgrimage to Elijah's town was not just about remembering him, but about remembering parts of themselves they had hidden away for too long. What unfolded on that day wasn't an event. It was a reverence. People sat in silence on benches Elijah never touched, but somehow inspired. They touched the cedar tree without words. They walked to the river and, one by one, dropped small slips of paper into the water, each inscribed with a name, a regret, a hope, a prayer. No one directed them. No one needed to. The collective heartbeat of that place, shaped by decades of quiet testimony, seemed to guide everyone exactly where they needed to be. And as the sun began to set behind the hills, a group of children lit a single lantern and released it into the sky. It rose slowly, as if reluctant to leave, then disappeared into the dark, like Elijah once had. Like we all will, someday. One young boy, no older than 10, stood by the edge of the river and asked his father a question that pierced through the moment. "Dad, why do people cry for someone they never met?" The father knelt beside him and took a long breath before answering. Because sometimes, when someone disappears, they leave behind a space that's big enough for all of us to find ourselves in. The boy didn't reply, but he leaned his head against his father's shoulder, and they stood there, together, listening to the quiet. And in that moment, they weren't just honoring a man, they were becoming part of the story he had unknowingly written with his life, his loss, his love. News of the gathering reached social media in fragments, a photo here, a video there. But the images that resonated most weren't flashy. They were tender. A grandmother hugging a stranger. A teenager writing, "Thank you," on the church steps. A woman singing softly to herself by the riverbank, unaware she was being recorded. There was no headline that could capture what had truly happened, because it wasn't just about Elijah anymore. It was about everybody who had ever been invisible, unheard, or left behind. Elijah had become more than a man. He was now a mirror, a sanctuary, a silent invitation to heal. And far away, in an assisted living home, an old man who had once served as Elijah's apprentice, long since retired, almost forgotten, sat in a wheelchair by his window. He saw the lantern float across the sky and a video on his tablet, and tears welled in his eyes. "You did it, Elijah," he whispered. "You reached them." His voice cracked under the weight of decades of waiting. Not for justice, not for explanation, but for this, the undeniable truth that a life doesn't need to be loud to be legendary. It just needs to be real. In the months that followed, a group of villagers, inspired by the outpouring of emotion, started a simple tradition. On the first Sunday of every month, they would gather at the church, light a single candle, and sit for exactly 40 minutes in total silence. 1 minute for each year Elijah was missing. They called it the Still Watch. No announcements were made. No one kept time. And yet, each month the pews filled. Elderly couples held hands. Teenagers who normally couldn't sit still remained frozen, eyes closed. Even dogs would rest their heads on laps, as if sensing the sacred. One Sunday, a woman who had recently moved to the village and knew nothing of Elijah stumbled into the church looking for shelter from the rain. She stayed for the still watch out of politeness, not expectation. But when the silence fell over her like a weighted blanket, she broke down. She wept in her coat sleeve, not understanding why. After the 40 minutes, no one asked her to explain. No one offered her platitudes. An older woman simply handed her a tissue and whispered, "You found him." That moment changed her life. She never left the village. She became one of its quietest, most faithful listeners. All over the world, people began creating their own versions of the Still Watch. Some met in libraries. Others gathered in parks, under bridges, beside forgotten cemeteries. They lit candles, shared Elijah's story, and sat in silence, not as a trend, but as a sacred resistance to the noise of the world. In Tokyo, a group of subway cleaners started a weekly gathering in the break room. In Nigeria, teachers incorporated Elijah's story into mindfulness lessons. In Brazil, an artist painted murals of faceless figures with glowing hearts and called them the Waiting Ones. The movement had no leader, no brand, no need for credit. It spread the way light does, from heart to heart, quietly, persistently. Somewhere in an old bookstore, a new copy of Buried Light was opened by a young woman who had recently lost her father. She read the first page and closed the book, hands shaking. Not because she was afraid, but because she suddenly understood something she had no words for before. That grief is not the end of love, but its transformation. That Elijah hadn't disappeared to be forgotten. He had simply been waiting for her to be ready. And maybe there was always the truth hidden in his silence. Not a mystery to be solved, not a tragedy to be mourned, but a message, softly spoken, eternally echoing. You are not alone. Even in the dark, even when no one is looking, you are not alone. As decades folded into each other, the story of Elijah transformed from a whispered legend into a living heartbeat within the community and beyond. His absence, once a source of shame and silence, became a wellspring of strength and solidarity. Families gathered not to mourn what was lost, but to celebrate what had been found in the stillness. Courage to face the uncomfortable, grace to forgive the unseen, and a fierce, enduring hope that light, no matter how deeply buried, will always find its way back. The church, with its weathered walls and quiet pews, stood as a testament not to failure, but to faith sustained through darkness. Visitors who once came seeking answers now came seeking connection. A weary traveler from a distant city wrote in the guest book, "I came looking for Elijah's story, but I found my own." Children who had never heard his name grew up surrounded by murals, stories, and traditions shaped by his resilience. His journal was no longer just a record of suffering, but a map, guiding others to find their voice, to carry their light, and to sit patiently with their own silences. And in the soft rustle of the trees lining the river, many claim to hear a gentle hymn, a melody only those who listen closely can perceive, Elijah's final sermon, still echoing. On what would have been Elijah's 100th birthday, the entire town gathered at the churchyard. Candles flickered in the twilight, casting long shadows on faces etched with stories of loss and renewal. A simple plaque was unveiled, not a grand monument, but a humble stone inscribed with just a few words. Here rests not a man, but a story of light born in silence. No names, no dates, only an invitation to remember, to listen, and to carry forward. The community knew that Elijah's legacy was not bound by bricks or bones. It lived in the choices made every day to speak truth, to hold space for pain, and to believe in the power of quiet endurance. His disappearance was never the end of his ministry. It was its most profound beginning, because sometimes the deepest impact is made not by those who are seen, but by those who choose to stay, even when no one is watching. As the candles were extinguished, and the crowd slowly dispersed into the night, a gentle breeze stirred the leaves. For those paying close attention, it was as if the wind itself carried a whispered benediction, a promise that stories like Elijah's never truly end. They live on, in every heart brave enough to listen, and in every silence filled with hope. The story of Pastor Elijah Moore is not simply one of disappearance or silence. It is a testament to the enduring power of truth, resilience, and faith. Across 40 years, his voice was buried beneath brick and shadow, yet it never truly faded. Instead, it grew louder in the hearts of those who dare to listen, teaching us that sometimes the deepest courage is found not in loud declarations, but in quiet endurance. Elijah's journey reminds us that being unseen does not mean being forgotten, and that hope can survive even the darkest confinement. As we reflect on his story, we are called to consider our own silences. How often do we choose comfort over confrontation? How many truths do we bury to avoid pain or conflict? Elijah's legacy challenges us to face those questions with honesty and bravery, knowing that the path to healing begins when we stop running from discomfort and start sitting with it, patiently, compassionately, and with unwavering faith. His life encourages us to be the light in the shadows, even when no one is watching. This story also reminds us that justice is not always swift, and redemption is rarely linear. It teaches us the value of community, that healing is a shared journey, carried by generations who refuse to let silence become erasure. Elijah's endurance became the soil from which a whole village's transformation grew, inspiring countless others beyond its borders. His story shows us that one person's steadfastness can ripple through time and space, changing lives in ways they never imagined. If Elijah's story moves something within you, a flicker of hope, a stirring of courage, or a gentle call to listen more deeply, then hold on to that feeling. Let it be the seed of your own quiet revolution. And remember, every voice matters, especially the ones too often drowned out. It is through honoring those voices, through listening, sharing, and acting, that we keep stories like Elijah's alive, powerful, and alive within us. If you felt the weight of this story, the hope it carries, or the courage it inspires, please join this community by subscribing to the channel. Like the video if it touched you, and share your thoughts below. Your voice is part of this ongoing story. Together, we can ensure that no story goes unheard, no light remains hidden, and no silence is left unbroken.